Namaste, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today, and thank you for all the great suggestions for the pose breakdowns. So here's the start of that with the first of many. And it is a shout out to Melissa from Michigan. She asked if I could give a pose breakdown for Ardha Chandrasana, half moon balance. Melissa, there are a couple of poses that I like to show before we get into that pose. And they're preparatory poses, the ones that I think that are important to be able to do well before you can balance well in half moon balance is triangle pose and tree pose. And before that, I would actually probably do Uttanasana, standing forward bend. And when I look at pose breakdown, it's like there's certain things that need to be warmed up, and there's certain things that, certain skills that we need to be able to understand so that we can actually perform that pose pretty well. So there are a lot of poses that we can do. I'm just giving you sort of my top three poses that I would recommend you do before you get to Ardha Chandrasana. So we'll start with Uttanasana, standing forward bend, and then Trikonasana, triangle pose, and then follow that up with Vrikshasana, tree pose, and then I'll actually go over the Ardha Chandrasana. So those three poses. And you can practice this with your feet together in Uttanasana. Have a little bit of spring in the knees or have the legs straight, whatever feels good. So I'm going to come on over, hinge at my hips, have a little spring in my knees, hold on to my elbows, and let myself calm down. So here's the Uttanasana. I would practice being on all four corners of the feet here because the tendency in Uttanasana is to pull the hips back toward the heels. Instead, shift your weight forward. You'll get more into the belly of the hamstring muscle, and those muscles need to be stretched out so that you can hold the standing leg well in the half moon balance pose. And now the Trikonasana, triangle pose. This time the legs are straight. The thing that I would ask you to consider really focusing on here is your alignment on the front leg. Yes, in the back leg, but right now specifically the front leg, because in order to balance well, you have to get the sitting bone and the heel to line up on top of one another. But also you have to have an alignment from the top of the thigh bone to the center of the knee to the shin, between the second and third toe. And if you don't really have that, what happens is the knee either pulls all the way in, which takes the pelvis back, or the knee pulls so far out. I have a tendency to rotate a little bit too much on my front leg and my standing poses, especially on my right leg. So my tendency is to sort of roll way too much and do too much of an external rotation. So all I want to do is just have a little bit of external rotation, enough to line everything up for me, for my body, enough to line up the thigh bone, the knee to the shin to this between the second and third toe. So that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm also going to focus on this, the leg pulling all the way up. So the top of the thigh actually sucks up into the pelvis, so I'm not hanging myself in the pose, hanging in the weight of the ligaments of the front leg. And there's a feeling that comes into the pelvis where it feels as though my legs are a part of my pelvis as opposed to separate of my pelvis. That gives me really good center stability. And then I'm going to focus on my back leg doing the same thing. Instead of everything moving away from my center, I'm going to pull things into my center just a little bit more so I get that sense of steadiness in my center. I know I keep saying center a lot of times, but this is a really interesting pose because we're using the center to balance, and we're also informing our limbs what to do from the center point. So the triangle pose with that understanding. I pull the leg up and in as I go into the pose. And then coming out. Okay, and now for the tree pose, Vrikshasana. This is going to teach me about actually balancing on one of the legs. So same sort of concept. I want to draw the leg up into my pelvis so I have a sense of my center and the stability of my center. And when I go to pick the leg up, I also want to focus on not doing this, to take the leg out. So I stay upright. It's like already I've committed to being open and lifted and upright. And I really sort of allow this leg to come up as high as it possibly can. I turn from the top of the thigh, then grab the foot and bring it up. And I'm not doing the lotus variation, I'm just doing the regular classical variation. Now I focus the same thing on sort of allowing my outer hips to pull into the center. Right? Do you see what happened? I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but as soon as I do that, so, everything sort of goes up. And I have this feeling of rooting and also lifting and rebounding at the same time. And then, of course, I can bring the hands here, I can bring the arms here, I can bring the arms here. It doesn't really matter at this point where you're holding your arms. But my legs are what I'm focusing on. And then keeping my navel soft toward the spine and having a sense of that on the camera to look like it's my right leg, but it's actually my left leg, opening up and pulling in to the socket just a little bit, to the top of the hip. And then, of course, coming down. Okay, so those are the three preparatory poses I would really focus on refining to go into the Ardha Chandrasana. So let's move on to the Ardha Chandrasana. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the half moon balance now, the Ardha Chandrasana, and I'm going to do it from Trikonasana, triangle pose. And you can see that I brought a block over to my mat, and we'll use that for my bottom hand. You, of course, don't have to use a block. You can use a chair if you need more height, or you can just put your hand down on the ground. The reason for using the block is so that you can lift up out of your pelvis and not sink down into the ligaments of the knee. So let's try it out. So I also wanted to kind of give you a little metric that if I go into Trikonasana, and for right now, I'm just going to put my hand at the hip. This is one of the things I recommend, actually, is keep your hand sort of out of the equation until it's really necessary, because it can kind of throw you off your center a little bit. So if you keep your hand back, but keep your shoulder open so that the chest stays open, you might actually have a better chance balancing also. So I'm going to go down into Trikonasana, but just for a moment, I'm going to bend my knee until I get to the 90 degree. When I get to the 90 degree, that's my metric for where the bottom hand has to go. So if I have a block, I just stretch it out as long as I can go, for as far as I can go. That's my metric. As long as it stays in the 90 degree, then I know I'm good to go. I come up off the back leg. I can take one step in, and then I lift my weight, or lean my weight rather, forward onto that front leg, and then start taking the back leg up. Now here's the tricky part. So the tailbone has to go down just a little bit so that this pelvis stays in a neutral position. So I'm not back here, right, throwing my pelvis way forward so that my hips go back. But instead I'm standing very tall on that leg and lifting the top of the thigh up into the pelvis so I feel a connection happen in my pelvis. And then with the top leg, I'm taking the leg and pulling it in toward my pelvis. And then look what happens. The belly starts to lift, the chest starts to open, and now I can go ahead and lift this top arm up. I can see why you like this pose, Melissa. It's actually one of my favorite poses as well. I put the hand back at the hip, bend the knee, reach way back, a generous step back, and come up. I hope those things helped you, and let me know how it goes. Thanks. Namaste.